2 decades ago, on a misty afternoon, I maneuvered around the twists and turns of Pacific Highway 1, where the sharp cliffs plunge into the rocky seashore near Big Sur. At a vista, I decided to pull over and take in the fresh air and scenery. As I gazed out at the horizon, my mind drifted into a reflective collage imbued with nostalgia, angst, and yearning, and a sense of ethereal trepidation. A deep inhalation, opening space to pause, exhaling, allowing these preoccupations to dissipate into the ocean air. A few moments later, out of this hazy drifting emerged a peculiar blend of fragrances. My eyes were closed, and my attention turned toward making them out. Of course, there was the ocean and the scent of redwood swirling all around me. But what caught my surprise was the distinct warm and sweet smell of sandalwood. Before I had time to process this realization, I also detected the sharp cooling sensation of sage, and right behind it, the smoky aroma of frankincense. These fragrances were commingled, yet individually distinguishable. I did my best to maintain drishti, what yogis call the inner gaze, to observe the phenomena without attachment or discursive thought. That lasted a few seconds at best, and I soon after returned to the car and resumed my journey down the California coast. Now, whether or not this really happened is not something I would be interested in defending. The meaning I ascribed to it at the time was that each of these fragrances signified my quest for meaning and identity. Just a few years prior, I basked in the glowing fire rocks of a Lakota sweat lodge, my skin and hair drenched in smoky earth and sage, clearly a break from the fundamentalist evangelical canopy which had enveloped most of my life until Nietzsche's death of metaphysics split the veil. After 3 days in the tomb, the hot coals ignited a resurrection, this time in the form of divine darkness, mysticism, and the rising of frankincense of the Eastern Orthodox tradition. It was a path of via negativa, apophatic theology, the con-celebration of faithful unknowing. And this lineage opened a dual interspiritual path that took me all the way to the dark jungles of South India, where sandalwood marked me with yet another hybridity and further ways of knowing and being. From Big Sur down to Los Angeles, I recounted my intense struggle to remain still, to resist going too far past the point of no return, to retain a sense of myself for fear of missing the mark. After all, I still believed in oneness and truth, in meaning and purpose. These commingling phrases were sometimes blissful, and at other times, points of contention, not to mention a formula for impulsivity and failed relationships. It would take many more years of teaching and learning before this tempest in the sea of ways of knowing would subside. It was then that I gained a sense of what it meant for Christ to calm the storm. It is the understanding that meaning and identity produce each other in a dynamic manner. Our ways of knowing are born of discursive regimes of truth, master narratives, durable stories that tell us this is reality, this is how it really is. Still, many of us will root for underdog protagonists who break the mold, while at the same time being swept up into discourses that reify the binaries that bind. Well, I suppose I should speak for myself, but even then, who is really speaking? I can see all the rolling eyes right now. I can hear them say, yeah, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? But in this context, that's a rhetorical question. Here, I speak of myself, my journey through experience and ways of knowing, a process by which my personhood is situated, intersected, and permeable, a barrier of skin, position, and identity through which waves of historical contingencies, discursive regimes of truth, ideologies, juxtapositions of metaphysics, and existential shrapnel pass through. Although I consider myself to be a slow learner and a bit of a late bloomer, I am filled with gratitude for each of the modalities of being human that I have been able to experience in this one lifetime. My positionality and reflexivity continues to be sharpened the more I revisit the philosophical traditions that imbued the historical milieu, social practices, ideological constructs of racialized, engendered, and nationalist master narratives. The liberalism that spawned both expanded conceptualizations of reality and subjectivity, but at the same time, they produced the contracted forms of individualism and rigid fundamentalisms. By surveying the philosophical landscape from which I was born and raised, I'm able to see how each of these ways of knowing have shaped and influenced my own sense of self, choices I've made, and the convictions that I retain or reject. I have come to accept the fact that there will continue to be inconsistencies in my thinking, but I am satisfied in being more aware of them. I have come to appreciate the utility of reason and critique for specific purposes, while at the same time realizing their finitude. As I trace the contours of the ways of knowing, I see both their beauty and their grotesque absolutist applications. It is clear that I have a proclivity towards critique, a propensity for social justice, anti-colonialism, and rematriation. But I have learned in post-structuralism and in indigenous methodologies that critique can be essentializing, closing off any escape from the walls of structural domination. This is not an abandonment of the good fight. Rather, it is an exhortation towards agential capacities through deconstruction and multiple ways of knowing. Through the myriad of voices I have heard, such as Foucault, St. Pierre, and Kovacs, I am encouraged to be on guard against a dismissive attitude towards these multiple ways of knowing. The truth is, with a small t, of course, is that the best practices in research are often narrowly determined by privileged ways of knowing. The icy gaze does not wish to entertain other ideas that trespass its codes of conduct. Other ways of knowing do not compute. They are inefficient, messy, and a waste of time. As St. Pierre mentions in her work on postmodern feminism, Gayatri Spivak thinks that people who do not have time to learn should organize the construction of the rest of the world. Neither do I, but this raises the question, can anything be done about it? What can be done to open up ways of knowing against the icy gaze? One of my mentors in indigenous research methodologies and education is Dr. Ku Kahakalau of Hawaii. In one of our professional development sessions, she emphasized that our pedagogy must be grounded locally and work outward if it is to be authentic for learners and the community. Simple as this may sound, the praxis or doing this simple thing is immediately confronted by the Western gaze, which Kovacs tells us must be interrogated before any movement is possible. The situation is hardly simple at all. The Western gaze of coloniality circumscribes, penetrates, and entangles with deep ideological constructs. But as we look outward from this remote indigenous island setting, the same can be said of the continental United States and beyond. The limitations of knowledge construction by institutions is an issue of power relations. Foucault reminds us to keep a focus on these relations in order to identify spaces for disruption and multiple points of resistance. Indigenous methodologies also emphasize relationality in theory, epistemology, axiology, and methodology. Contrary to those who accuse qualitative research as hopelessly relativistic and lacking in efficacy, these ways of knowing have the ability to interrogate the icy gaze of positivist regimes of truth. Its strength is in the plurality of modes of inquiry. In this place, there are many mansions. The subject is not dead, critique is not absent, and freedom is not a necessary chaos. As Patel writes, the tools of deconstruction have some utility, but in their disconnect from theorizing more generative spaces and how we might arrive there, these same tools of deconstruction show their limits. I look forward to my next visit to Big Sur in the Pacific Coast. I intend to revisit that same spot of contingent aromas. I envision the vast expanse of the horizon, realizing it is just one of many. I will not fret about the tensions of identity, for I understand that we are complicit in the production of ourselves. The meanings ascribed to the ascending fragrances of renewal will be those of subversive citations from within. There is an agentic joy in pondering this excursion. Even now, I can experience the embrace of that vista, where pauses and shifts should not be seen as reasons to abstain from interacting, but rather should shape how we read and understand all writing is temporally located. This stance itself is counter to coloniality and its myth of universal truth. On that precipice, the icy gaze is averted by many knowing eyes, or as my Hawaiian kumu would say, makavalu.